Well, today on the programme, we're asking, does humanism need God? Angus Ritchie and Stephen Law join me as my special guests in studio today. Angus is one of the authors of a recent Theos report titled The Case for Christian Humanism, Why Christians Should Believe in Humanism and Humanists in Christianity. Stephen Law is a philosopher, well known on the show, of course. He's been in several times over the years. He heads up the Centre for Inquiry in the UK, and he's criticised the report and its claims. And we're going to give you links to that report and to Stephen's blog for Centre for Inquiry, where he's criticised it, and be talking about the whole aspect of whether humanism at some level and in its inherent beliefs about the worth of humans, dignity, morality, reason, is actually dependent at some level on the concept of God, Christianity and so on. So that's what we're looking forward to discussing today on the programme that aims to get you thinking. Unbelievable. Welcome along, gentlemen both, to the programme today. It's great to have you with me. Let me just set this up a little bit for those who perhaps aren't familiar with what this report is about, Angus, because you and Nick Spencer, I think, were responsible for this one. And you say that talking about Christians versus humanists and humanism versus religion, as if the two concepts were somehow opposed, is commonplace these days, but actually they're not, and it matters why. The Amsterdam Declaration on Humanism apparently states that morality is an intrinsic part of human nature. But you say the problem isn't whether Christianity can support humanism in these beliefs, but whether atheism can. And this is what you've raised in this new report. Specifically, you argue three of humanism's most important fundamentals are difficult to sustain on an atheistic basis: human dignity, morality, and reason. So do you want to tell us a little bit about this report, where it's come from, and why you've decided to have a pop at atheists who claim that humanism is theirs, and you're saying, no, not so fast?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, have a pop's an interesting phrase. I mean, we hope that in some ways this will be a genuinely helpful intervention, and we actually say on the cover and in the introduction that the aim is to assist humanistic values lest their opponents might take advantage. So we are genuinely aiming to be helpful here. There are, I think, four things we're trying to do. The first is just to make the point that the word humanism is and needs to be shared. That goes back a long way. Obviously, humanism has a pedigree outside Christianity historically, but for centuries there have been Christian humanists, and we would say, part of the reason that the term is now not shared as well as it should be is partly down to Christians. We've some of us have in our language used humanism to describe an entirely atheistic worldview. But, early 20th century Jacques Maritain, integral humanism, that was a Catholic Christian view. Pope Francis, rather helpfully for us, although I don't imagine it was on his mind at the time, a week before the report was published, he was in the European Parliament saying Europe risks losing its humanistic spirit if it loses its transcendent set of values. So in a sense, the first point is that humanism is a shared term, and there's no land grab here.
Has it been co-opted, though, in your view, by atheists at some level?
I mean, I think there are atheists who have wanted to be possessive about the term, and there are Christians who have colluded in that. But there's a strong strand of Christian thought. When Catholicism, as it consistently has, uses the term humanism, it's not doing that to wind up atheists. So there's the term has to be shared.
I mean, you did wind up some atheists. I know that Andrew Copson, who heads up the British Humanist Association, did label it a land grab and even an attempt to troll a whole worldview. What do you make of that?
Part of my response was to say that the Holy Father really has better things to do than troll the British Humanist Association. And, as one often finds himself saying to kids, we need to learn to share. We're kind of both on it. So I think land has been grabbed in both directions on this. There's a tug of war. Let's be sensible, and I think that brings me to the second point, really, which is that this isn't just. I mean, obviously, words evolve and change, but there is something of substance here. It's perhaps a provocative way into a question of substance, as you say. The Amsterdam Declaration is the kind of 2002 statement agreed internationally, the World Humanist Congress. by which they meant atheist humanism.
Yes.
We thought the fairest way into this debate is to start with a characterization of atheist humanism, which they themselves point to.
Yeah.
So the Amsterdam Declaration is really interesting to read. It's got a couple of points where I would wince slightly at references to religious dogma, but basically it's making a positive statement from an atheist perspective, and it's remarkable how much of it Christians do or ought to support. So that's really the second point we're making, is that this isn't just some weird verbal thing that we're both fighting over a term. The substance of the positive, ethical and rational view of atheist humanism is actually
a shared one.
A shared one, pretty much. And
and the more, in a sense, then controversial aspect of it that I think Stephen primarily takes issue with is this claim that, in fact, though, to a foundation for these principles outlined in this report, in the declaration and so on, are better founded on a view that includes God rather than excludes God and so on. So we'll come to all that because we want to lay that out clearly as well. But let's just bring Stephen in at this point. Stephen, thanks for coming on the show today. Do you describe yourself as a humanist? Is that the kind of, if someone said, "Oh, what are you?" you'd say humanist as opposed to atheist, or?
Yeah. Well, both. I like both those terms. I don't have a problem with either. I think that the thing to be clear about is that although the word is used to describe both religious people and all sorts of atheists, those who on the secular side, the atheist side, describe themselves as humanists and organise under that banner mean something different by the term. They are adding a number of additional conditions in particular.
Yeah.
And they're requiring atheism or agnosticism, for example. And that's how they use the term. That's the meaning that it has come to possess for those within that particular community. But of course, the word has a long history and it's been used in various other ways and continues to be used in other ways too.
I mean, you're not too concerned about the terminology per se, then, Stephen.
Not as long as it's acknowledged that the word humanism is used and there's this established usage, this established meaning on which humanists are atheist or agnostic.
Yeah.
It's kind of atheism plus. As long as that's being acknowledged, and Angus acknowledges that, I think I'm happy.
Yeah. I mean, your bigger beef, as it were, with the report is these claims, which I think we'll need Angus to spell out at some level, that the values that undergird humanism are actually find a better foundation in Christianity specifically than an atheistic worldview. This is something you've come across time and again,
yes.
and you've aimed to refute in various different ways.
Well, yeah. Well, just to get our bearings then, it seems to me that those who hold supernatural beliefs, not just religious beliefs, but all sorts of supernatural beliefs, will often run a certain kind of argument for why their belief is actually fairly reasonable, more reasonable than the alternative. And the argument that you tend to find repeated again and again and again is, here's something deeply mysterious. We don't see how we can answer this question unless we posit a hidden being with magical powers. And of course, if you posit a hidden being with magical powers, you can explain anything that you want to. Immediately. It's a super convenient form of explanation. So, when we couldn't explain why the planets moved in the strange way that they did across the skies, deeply baffling. Why did they do that? Because they're agents, hidden agents, and they want to do that, and they have the magical power to do it. Why are there diseases and natural disasters? Again, we attributed these things to agents. It provides a convenient, quick, and plausible answer to provide that kind of answer. If you can't find your keys, it may be deeply mysterious to you why they are now on the mantelpiece when you could have sworn that you left them on the sofa. I might come in and say, Justin, has it occurred to you that there's a gremlin living in your house and he has the magical ability to appear and move keys around at will, and moreover, that's what he wants to do. I can immediately and conveniently explain what you are now struggling to explain, how your keys could possibly have ended up over there. So you might think then that I might think that I can bring you on board onto my gremlin hypothesis, and that would clearly be absurd, wouldn't it? You can see the general problem with this strategy in terms of persuading people that they should come on board with a particular kind of belief in a particular kind of hidden being with magical powers. Just take a step back and think about that for a moment before we get into the nitty-gritty.
Well, we're going to aim to get into some nitty-gritty in the course of the programme and find out from Angus Ritchie why a magical being with magical powers, I don't know whether that's exactly what he'd suggest is behind his belief in the intrinsic worth of humans and so on. But at any rate, Angus, as I've mentioned, is one of the team who put together this report on the case for Christian humanism, available from theosthinktank.co.uk. Stephen Law, our atheist guest, responding today from the Centre for Inquiry. You can find his blog there at centrefororinquiry.net and specifically to this report. So if you're interested in getting in touch as well in the course of today's programme, be delighted to hear from you. Email in unbelievable@premier.org.uk. You can find us online, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. You can find today's show, comment underneath that, share it with others, find the podcast, and even ways into our Facebook and Twitter accounts too. All of that I'll remind you of later on in the programme as well. Today we're asking, does humanism need God?
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
So tell us, Angus, you say there are three ways in which the fundamental tenets of humanism and what it believes about humanity are not really well supported by an atheistic worldview. You label them as human dignity, human morality and human reason. Topics that we've done in one form or another over the years on this programme. Yeah. So we're not going to try and unpack those all fully in the course of our time together. But give us a flavour of what you're saying across these three areas and why you believe actually a Christian worldview is a better foundation for humanism on that level.
Yes, thank you. I think, they vary to some extent because part of what we're doing is making if you like, an apologetics case for Christianity. But we also have an interest, acknowledging that it is unlikely that our arguments will be so compelling that everyone will turn into a theist or a Christian. We're interested in atheists who are humanists, having a form of atheism that doesn't undercut it. Sure. So there is a genuine sense that on some of these issues we are both being provocative and genuinely trying to be helpful. And perhaps human dignity is the most obvious example of that, that I think a number of atheists, some of them people who get a lot of airtime at the British Humanist Association as advocates of this position, actually have views that when you press them do cut off the atheist branch. And it's not clear to me how the branch will remain. It feels to me quite intrinsically wobbly, but I'm genuinely all ears as to how that's going to work.
I was going to say, for instance,
Sam Harris.
I think, would
be a key person. I mean, Harris's view, and if you go to the BHA website, there's a very positive, glowing review of Harris in conversation with British Humanist Association Vice President Richard Dawkins. And Dawkins says, I used to think science couldn't really provide, he said this on the cover of one of Harris's books, I used to think science couldn't really provide a basis for morality, but Sam Harris has made it all clear. And actually I think there's some really dangerous territory here, because Harris has quite, in my view, quite a crass view of the read-over from maximum human pleasure and well-being to the right thing. He writes polemically with no awareness that this is really tricky territory. And there's a particular example he gives, and it might sound like the kind of thing you'd throw around in a seminar room, of utility monsters. So, if we have this view that you want to maximise pleasure and minimise pain, what if there were beings who gained a vast amount of pleasure from human beings being in pain? And he says, well, he doesn't quite say thank God, but thankfully there aren't. But if there were, I guess that would be right. Well, that kind of worldview, I would argue, is deeply anti-humanistic. That undercuts key things in the Amsterdam Declaration about how human beings are not in that way interchangeable. There is an intrinsic dignity we have as humans, and that's not tradable off. And that has implications which Christians don't always get right, even though I think Christian teaching is clear on this, about the impermissibility of things like torture. So our point here is, in the name of, and we're not setting up Aunt Sally's, in the name of humanism of an atheist kind, a key part of the public polemic for this is a position that undercuts humanism. And we would like to make common cause with atheists who think that's dangerous, but also to hear how they're going to ground it.
So if there is, and it's in the title, isn't it, humanism, that there's something special about humans. Is that, well, okay, you're about to...
that is the key.
You're about to object
I mean,
to
you
that,
have
Stephen.
to be a little bit careful, because it's actually potentially quite a misleading title, as I explain in my book, A Very Short Introduction to Humanism. People often get the wrong end of the stick about what the term means. But just to return to Sam Harris, I like Sam Harris's books, and I read them, but I'm not persuaded by everything that he says, and I think some of the things that he has said are fairly silly. Some might suggest even potentially dangerous. I wouldn't take that view, but he doesn't represent all humanists. In fact, I would suggest he is rather atypical. There are people that say silly things on both sides, dangerous things on both sides. I seem to remember a few years ago, wasn't it, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor described atheists as less than fully human. Now, that's a pretty dangerous thing to say, it strikes me, being said on the other side. It's easy to cherry-pick your people, your ideas, your arguments, and use them as straw men and then say, there, I've dealt with the entire position. Sure. I wouldn't suggest that all Christians think that atheists are less than fully human. I wouldn't load this pretty odious view, it seems to me, onto every other Christian. Similarly, please don't assume that Sam Harris represents all atheist humanists.
No,
he does not. Okay. Although he has some very interesting ideas. Some of them I agree with, some of them I do not.
Some of them you don't. All right, just talk to us about humanism then. Do humanists believe that there's something intrinsically special about humans as opposed to the rest of
I would say that as a rule
world?
They don't.
You don't?
I don't. No. Which is odd then, because this is one of the things that we're being told that we sign up to, and that we're having a hard time explaining, and it turns out we don't sign up to it. No, it seems to me that what matters, what's morally important about human beings that makes them special and worthy of special moral consideration and respect and so on, is not that the fact that they happen to belong to a particular species. It seems to me that the relevant moral boundaries are not species boundaries. They are other kinds of boundary. And if you ask most humanists what those boundaries are, they will say, well, they'll disagree, actually, amongst... you'll find disagreement and debate, but they will say things like, well, the capacity to suffer is a very important factor. We should not be causing unnecessary suffering. That is morally wrong. Now, this pushes the boundary away from just humans and allows us to incorporate all sorts of other species into our moral sphere. And most humanists are more than prepared to do that, in fact. But
surely most humanists would still say, nonetheless, if it's the choice between a dolphin's life or even a highly evolved, ape or whatever, and a human, the human is somehow more important. We would choose the human over...
But not because they're a human. Not because they belong to one species rather than another.
What is it?
Because they have perhaps a greater capacity to suffer, because they have the ability to make plans and carry them through in a way that a dolphin does not. There are all sorts of explanations and answers that might be provided here. It's a very complicated and difficult question. What I would steer you away from is an answer which is overly simplistic, which says that, as a matter of fact, it's just the species boundary. Everything this side of the boundary, everything human, that gets a special moral respect that we don't give anything on the other side of the boundary. Now, I doubt that even Angus really thinks that. I mean, supposing aliens appeared on the Earth, are we going to say, oh no, you don't get any moral respect because you're not a human? Or are you going to perhaps extend the moral consideration? And then my question would be, on what basis?
Okay.
And is it going to be a theological one or a non-theological one? Is it going to turn out to be exactly the same one that I would be using?
Let's let Angus respond to some of these issues.
I think the challenge here is not so much one of extending boundaries, which I think clearly we need to, and we would need to in that example. It's, call it simple, but what we've done is we've taken the Amsterdam Declaration as the basis for humanism. Humanism is ethical. It affirms the worth, dignity and autonomy of the individual and the right of every human being to the greatest possible freedom compatible with the rights of others. So our observation, there's a really interesting line of argument to have, as it were somewhere else, about whether that's the right position to have. So if the secular philosopher is going to say, well, we don't want to be too dogmatic, maybe, let's think reasonably about where we draw the lines. Fine. All we're observing is that there seems to be quite a clear line drawn here. It isn't exclusive, and I agree with Stephen that there are both questions about the moral worth of, animals and of any other species that might come to be found. But a bottom line for Christian ethics is something about the inviolable dignity of every human being.
And
now,
that's
the question here is,
which
we press in the report, is, well, if the dignity argument is linked simply to certain kinds of capacity, what happens when those capacities are absent? Does the human being still have dignity? Because it looks like the statement of humanism, which Christians and atheists could sign up to this point, says that it does. And
so it's dependent on a sort of slightly utilitarian argument about, well, if you're able to reason and have some kind of capacity for being able to experience suffering and all the rest of that. But you're saying there might be examples where we might say, well, what about the person who is in a coma or the very early development of
person
life,
who isn't very able to make plans at any point in their life,
who has
doesn't have
a
very
learning
much
disability,
capacity to suffer,
sure.
feel pain. And I think the key point here, and in a sense, if this point's conceded, I would say, well, hold on, this is all we're saying in the report. The key point here is, rightly or wrongly, whatever you make of the Christian moral tradition, it says this very clearly. The Christian moral tradition says that something like the Amsterdam Declaration on this is right.
Yeah.
And one can lampoon or debate why, but it does. The question for atheists is what argument they're advancing that justifies that. Now, I'm not saying there can't be one. I'm all ears as to what it is.
Yes.
Our worry is it looks like quite a lot of the key arguments in the field, although they're far more sophisticated than Sam Harris, have the danger that they seem to equivocate on this. And that's all we're really arguing.
Okay. We'll come back to you for a response in just a moment, Stephen. We're already at the end of our...
remember the point.
We're already at the end of our first part of our show, and so, time is flying. And we're talking about humanism today. Does it need God? Angus Ritchie and Nick Spencer are the authors of a recent Theos report on this entitled The Case for Christian Humanism. And so we're asking whether dignity, morality, human reason are all actually fundamentals of the atheist humanistic ideal, but in fact very difficult to justify on an atheistic basis. So says Angus Ritchie, and wonders whether theism, Christianity specifically, is a better foundation for that. Obviously, Stephen Law, our atheist in the studio today, disagrees. Interested to hear from you as well. I did promise to give out ways to get in touch via social media, at UnbelievableJB, if you want to tweet me about this, and facebook.com/UnbelievableJB to join in via Facebook. And I'll be back with my guests in just a moment's time.
Premier Christianity, for cutting-edge commentary and encouraging stories. Tackling the big issues to help you live out your faith.
With the film version of best-selling erotic novel 50 Shades of Grey set to hit UK cinemas, in the latest magazine we examine the new permissiveness in pornography. Labour leader Ed Miliband sits down to talk to us about church, and we find out why an evangelical church in Cairo has had a miraculous role in healing Egypt's recent political turmoil. All that plus interviews, news, reviews, and your favourite columnists.
For your free copy of Premier Christianity, visit premierchristianity.com/free sample.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Great to have you with us this Saturday afternoon on the programme. Aiming to get you thinking, of course, every Saturday. I'm Justin Briley with Unbelievable, part of Faith Explored. If you want to find out more about today's show, my guests, as we discuss whether humanism needs God, go to premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. Loads of past shows there as well, and you can comment underneath them, find your way to the podcast and all sorts besides. Angus Ritchie and Stephen Law join me on the programme today. Angus has been trolling atheists' worldview, according to some at least, but in terms of a recent report that he co-authored with Nick Spencer for Theos. It says, should Christians believe in humanism and humanists in Christianity? Because it's his contention that the recent, well, not so recent, but a declaration on what humanists stand for that was signed in Amsterdam by people from all over the world actually is easier to justify on a Christian worldview than an atheist one. So responding to that is Stephen Law from the Centre for Inquiry in the UK. He's criticised the report and its claims. So coming back to you, Stephen, effectively, Angus is saying, well, just reiterate the very simple point you're making, which is show us how.
Yeah, the simple point is there's a Christian
stands.
story, whatever you make of its merits, which says that human beings are quite specifically made in the image of God. That means that the affirmation in the Amsterdam Declaration about the intrinsic dignity of every human being makes sense to that worldview. The question is, on an atheistic worldview, how do we explain the intrinsic dignity of every member of the species regardless of their specific capacities?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. You will find atheists disagree about the extent to which the different capacities and abilities and so on should be factored in, whether they've got them now, whether they might come to acquire them in the future and so on. There are all sorts of complexities and subtleties here. What the vast majority of humanists don't think is that there's something about the species boundary which is morally relevant, which is morally important, that everyone this side of the boundary, every being this side of the boundary gets special respect, special dignity, everyone the other side of the boundary does not. That, it seems to me, is an unjustifiable position and potentially quite a dangerous. So
do you, in that
position.
sense, disagree with the Amsterdam Declaration?
I'm not at all comfortable about it. I want to say that if aliens turn up tomorrow, if they're showing the relevant capacities and ability to suffer and all of the other things that we hold dear, then I would certainly extend to them the same moral consideration that I extend to members of the human species, and on a much the same basis. And so would Angus, of course. So he's using the same criteria, but no, he wants to smuggle in an extra special one,
but I mean,
which says that no, every human gets a special status, irrespective of whether they have the ability to suffer now or in the future, the ability to make plans, or indeed are even conscious. And actually, I'm not sure that a brain-dead vegetable person does deserve the same moral respect as, say, a chimpanzee. I'm not convinced that that's true. I am not sure that it's right not to torture one innocent person to save a billion. Do you? What do you think?
I mean, and there are even some atheist humanist philosophers who have suggested that infanticide may not be out of bounds.
No. Let's not. That's not what I'm saying.
No.
Let's focus on things like torturing an innocent person to save a million. Many Christians would do it. They would.
Right.
They would say, you know what, the consequences of our not doing this are just so absolutely appalling for humanity that even factoring in human dignity, I mean, perhaps especially factoring in human dignity, we really would have no choice under those extraordinary circumstances. Many Christians would say that. So it's, this is a position. This is not a Christians take one view and atheists take another view, and the atheists are in terrible trouble. The fact is that these are just extraordinarily difficult questions, difficult problems. And what is dangerous, it seems to me, is to oversimplify them by saying, no, don't worry about all of that stuff. There's just some special God-given difference between human beings and everything else, and we get the special respect and they don't, and it's as simple as that. Because now we're not looking at science, and we're not looking at the common sense criteria that we already all normally apply. We're now appealing to differences which are magical, which are invisible and which we have to accept
but
on the say-so of the theologians. And they are remarkably unreliable guides to where these magical
what
differences
Angus,
lie.
you're saying, I think, is that actually lots of atheist humanists are also apparently coming up with a magical definition that does prioritise humans, even though obviously Stephen has an issue with that.
I think there are 2 points to make here. One simple and one much more complicated. The simple point is that it actually looks like, if I've understood him correctly, Stephen agrees with a key claim of the report, which is that when you take the first fundamental of modern humanism, we've left it to the atheist humanists to define this worldview. They've had a congress, they've all signed up to this. Go to the British Humanist Association website, click through, this is what they say
they're
atheist
all signed
humanism's
up.
values are. And I'm not saying every atheist, but this is a public face of it, and all we're saying on this is that a Christian worldview would justify that sentence fully and unequivocally. Actually, we'll come on to some more complex stuff in a minute, and it appears that Stephen is agreeing, as I understand him, that a sensible atheist worldview wouldn't. It would be more equivocal about that sentence. So that, so in a sense,
and so would many Christians.
Yeah. But the contention of the report is, let's get back to that. Let's see. This is quite significant. The contention of the report is that the statement presented by the International Humanist Ethical Union as the agreed position of atheist humanists, their values are better sustained by Christianity than by atheism. We're not actually, the report doesn't offer, I'm quite happy to give on but the report doesn't offer a line-by-line defence of them. We're just observing that these allegedly humanist values that the humanists have put together themselves are better sustained by Christian worldview than atheist worldview. And that appears to be, to my surprise, common ground between us.
Well, first of all, even that what you've just said is not true. I mean, you can say that humans have a special dignity and are deserving of special respect without saying that it's by virtue of being human that they deserve it. And it may be that the authors of that particular report are not committed to that view. There may be other it may be that the boundary that they're drawing just extends far beyond the boundary of human beings.
But includes humans.
But includes human beings. But in any case, there are very many humanists that simply wouldn't sign up to the view which you appear to be attributing to those who authored this document, which is that the non-human boundary has some special moral significance. I wrote the very short introduction to humanism for the OUP. I did not include that claim, and I very explicitly didn't include it. Yes. And that book was read by all sorts of humanists who
are humanists just a bit confused then, because they're saying
they're not
one
confused.
thing in one document and agreeing with you on another book?
Well, it's not even clear that this document contradicts what I'm saying, is my point.
Okay.
Well, this is why I think there are two things we need to unscramble here. One is, can the boundary be extended beyond the human? And, I think there are some really interesting questions there about what worth should be given to non-humans. Both ones we know about and any that we might encounter. And I agree with Stephen that those are really interesting questions that we need to discuss and deliberate on. My point is, and Nick's point, is that the line of argument being used here to justify the worth, dignity and autonomy of human beings is one that doesn't seem to give it to them all. So the key thing isn't about hospitality beyond the human race. The key thing is to what extent this applies unequivocally within the human race. Now, at this point, absolutely, in one sense, very happy to accept I'm making an appeal to a revealed truth of the Christian faith. That doesn't mean it's magic. That doesn't mean any theologian gets to make it up. There's a strong tradition within Christianity of offering reasons for trusting the revelation. So all we're saying, and as I say, it does appear that we might be in agreement on this, is that when you take the core claim of, number one claim of the Amsterdam Declaration, that a mainstream Christian tradition, let's just look at for example, the denomination that is both the largest in the world and has the most explicit and unified teaching, I guess, is the Catholic Church. It's very clear, and I agree with Stephen. Not everyone would agree with this, but it would say no torture. There are things that just are wrong to do, and so there is this sort of inherent dignity which is humanist, which supports this, and it seems that we're right in this.
And is there a worry that atheist humanists if they do digress from a kind of view of the intrinsic worth of human beings, and it is dependent upon their faculties, their ability to reason, to experience suffering, and so on, is that a problem for you at any level? Are there situations where we should be concerned and wonder what path that may take us down at any level, Stephen?
I'm not quite sure what you're getting at.
I suppose I am. I mean, you cut me off earlier when I mentioned infanticide, but that is where some people have gone with this and said a child, even up to a couple of years old, is not the fully developed human that
but that would be a remarkably crude. Non-theistic. I mean, it's like you're wheeling out Cardinal Murphy O'Connor again. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
But then,
it's a fairly
fairly
Let's just stick to what sensible humanists actually believe. And stop willing these nut jobs in.
Right? No, I agree. I agree.
I'm not claiming to sort of say this is in any way a prevalent view among humanists, but I guess what I'm saying is some people say that if you go down that road of valuing human dignity in their ability to reason, then you could be justified in saying that there is less worth in a child where those faculties haven't developed.
If you were some idiot who thought that only the ability to reason in a very sophisticated way marked you out for special dignity, right? Oh, well, children don't get it then, right? But what humanist thinks that? Now, the fact is that they don't think that, or I've never met one that's ever explicitly given me that view. It seems to me a bizarre view. What most humanists think is that there are all sorts of things that need to be taken into consideration in weighing up how we treat other beings, humans and non-humans, ethically. And the ability to reason may factor in there, but actually many of them deliberately exclude that, actually. They're quite explicit. They say, no, that's not what matters morally. What matters is, say, the capacity to suffer. Children clearly can suffer. We all can suffer unless we are going to be comatose forever and never come back, then perhaps those individuals will fall the wrong side of the boundary. But there are even many Christians who would say, they fall the wrong side of the boundary. So it's not as if there is a major problem here for humanism that I can see. I just can't see what the problem is.
What's your problem then?
Because you were
hinting at the problem, Angus.
The problem is, I mean, Stephen has a very different view from me on how reasonable it is to assert this, but Christians believe that there is, a revealed truth, that we are made in the image of God, and that gives every single human being an intrinsic dignity, regardless of any of these specific capacities. And therefore, we're very happy with the affirmation made in the Amsterdam Declaration, which has no equivocation about any kind of capacities in it. Our worry is we're all ears to hear it, but our concern is that it looks like the key arguments being advanced for the dignity of human beings by atheists are ones which are capacity dependent, particularly once you've said, as Stephen says, there really is no significant species boundary here, in a way that means we don't end up valuing the worth, dignity and autonomy of every individual. Now, you can then say, it's fine. I mean, this is just where reason takes us. Fine. But then it takes us away from the values that were supposed to be stated as the fundamentals of humanism. Sure. That's all the report's observing.
In one document, but they're not, in various other documents, including the book I wrote. So, different views amongst humanists about this.
Give us a kind of concrete example of, inevitably it'll be hypothetical, but could you envisage, Angus, if you took Stephen's reasoning, that it is about capacities and so on, that you could get to a situation where if it was the choice between saving a chimpanzee who has significant has all their faculties and everything available, and a human who is perhaps at some level extremely mentally impaired and has a very bad quality of life and will need constant round-the-clock care to alleviate suffering for the rest of their life, that you're sort of morally obliged to go with the one that has the better faculties, i.e. the chimpanzee, and the better quality of life.
Well, that's my question. I don't want to make that claim, but the question is, and then we move on to areas like, people's capacities towards the end of life. Now, I don't want to get specifically into the detail of assisted dying, but it does strike me that, even those who think that's something where that's a line we should go down, which I don't, want to be very careful in that territory. And if we haven't got a strong notion of the worth, dignity and autonomy of every individual, there just looks like there begins to be a slippery slope here. And I don't want to lampoon where that ends up, but hold on, we've got a clear view which is with fundamentals of humanist values being offered by the International Humanist Association. That looks very clear. That puts the human into humanism, and very happy with that. It looks like here it's a delicate line to walk in argument, because I don't want to attribute to Stephen or anyone else ludicrous views they don't hold. I want to say, tell me the story as to how we don't end up having the position of very vulnerable people who haven't got some of the qualities Stephen listed earlier. How do they get the kind of intrinsic dignity?
How do we ensure that they are as intrinsically valuable as someone who does have a greater amount of these qualities?
It's more, the answer will be more complicated than because God says so. It's always going to be more complicated than that.
And that's fine. But the question is, do we have an answer at all that affirms the worth, dignity and autonomy?
I can give you various answers in which clearly people who are towards the end of their life and are mentally incapacitated but clearly have the ability to suffer, if your criterion is the ability to suffer, that's what makes you gives you moral dignity and makes you deserving of moral respect, then that person clearly should not be killed for convenience sake. But let me ask you a question.
Can I just press that a second? Okay, just if I might. That's a very interesting one, because if the ability to suffer is a key criterion, you'd have thought the ability must be linked to what the criterion implies. So if the thing is that you can suffer, why would that be a reason for not peacefully and in a non-suffering way enabling someone to die? I mean, it's funny that the ability to suffer, if that was, as it were, all that was left, and there's no intrinsic dignity.
I'm in favour of suicide. If that person wants to die and is suffering terribly, then I don't have a particular problem with allowing them and perhaps providing them with the facilities to do that. But let me ask you a question. Yeah. Okay, so if you think that human beings have a special dignity by virtue of being human beings given to them by God, and we'll have to take that on the basis of revelation, if you think that is true, then suppose we have a human being lying before us who is comatose, who is brain damaged, who will never regain consciousness. If the only way that you can save humanity from some awful disaster is by killing that one person, will you do it?
I mean, that's a very interesting ethical question.
I'm putting the same kind of question. You put that question to me, I'm putting it to you. You can't. It's tough. These are tough questions.
And there are tough questions.
Okay.
And I think
it's tough both sides. But what actually would you do? What would you do?
I think that is. I mean, I think there are lines that I wouldn't cross around torturing an innocent person. So I think we do have a disagreement as to there being some inviolable lines. The question of whether there's an inviolable line at the point where someone is not actually conscious and would never be conscious again.
Capacities.
Right.
Is an interesting one.
Yeah.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it is. I mean, we're talking about extreme, in a sense, thought experiments at this point, and tends to be that in the real world, there aren't quite as stark
no, but look, there was this thought about, this is dangerous, atheists are dangerous, their ideas are dangerous. But look, what about the danger in this situation? That somebody signs up to, God drew the line there. This person is on this side of the line. Mm-hmm. I can't apply criteria like capacities and so on. I just have to accept that they get this dignity. And so I will allow humanity to be wiped from the face of the earth rather than kill this person. I mean, that is a dangerous view. And that is Angus's view, or at least he's teetering now on the edge of it.
Right? No, that's not my view.
Okay, you're teetering though. You don't
No. My view is that there is always an issue that so that there are some things that are simply never compatible with treating someone as being, as having worth, dignity and autonomy. And there are other things that we should be extremely hesitant to do. So, I guess, given that I'm not a pacifist and that Christianity has a strong tradition of just war theory, there are situations in which innocent people end up dying. But there's a dignity to individuals that mean that there's not an endless trade-off here, and that dignity doesn't depend on their capacities.
We've talked at some level about this, so I'm thinking with the remaining time we've got, it would be interesting to try and get to one other area that comes up in the report, and that kind of, I think, is reason is another important facet of this. We'll come to that as well. So just before we do that, a reminder that if you want to get in touch about today's show, you're more than welcome to drop me a line to unbelievable@premier.org.uk. My guests today, Angus Ritchie and Stephen Law, as we ask, does humanism need God? And if you want to catch up on this programme, send it on to others and indeed comment and get in touch. premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Yes, exciting stuff in the studio today because we've got really an interesting debate going on, and we've talked at some level now about human dignity, worth, and so on, and whether you can justify it on atheism versus Christianity, and what humanists actually believe, I suppose, about where this line is drawn. I mean, another interesting aspect, though, of this report, and again something that Stephen criticises in his response blog, is that the very faculty of human reason, which is so is so important within the atheist humanist tradition, is also something that you can only really be justified in a theistic worldview, as far as you're concerned, Angus, and is much harder, at least, to justify. Just give us the bare bones of that, and let's see what Stephen has to say in response.
I think the tricky thing here, and it applies, I think, most trickily in the case of reasoning about moral issues, is if the capacities we have, if the reason we've got them is either selective advantage or random mutation, why would they track an objective truth? I think that there are some kinds of rational capacities that have a fairly obvious justification in that way. There are others where that's, and the moral case is, I think, the most clear, where that isn't available. I think that's a problem for atheist worldviews in general. There's a more specific problem, I think, around, and I think this is not an impossible one to get over, but there's something of a tightrope for atheists to walk here around what it is to believe things because we have a reason to. So that I'm not sure that Stephen would fall into this category, but there certainly are people who would very confidently say they're atheists, atheist humanists, whose account of human beings in the natural order leaves it very hard to see why we believe things because we have good reason. It looks like the mechanistic nature by which we come to beliefs kind of undermines the sense that they're rational, and that to avoid that, I wonder if you end up with a view that needs to have quite a high doctrine of consciousness and the self of a kind that not all atheists would be comfortable with. So one of those arguments, the one about how does reason, and in particular moral reasoning, kind of latch on to any kind of objective truth, I think is tricky pretty much across the piece. The second one is one, I think, just where atheists need to tread carefully.
I mean, you've obviously done a separate report which specifically outlined this as well. We've perhaps given a fuller treatment there, and obviously we had you in to debate that as well. And you've debated something not dissimilar with Alvin Plantinga on this programme in the distant past, Stephen. So you're familiar with where this is coming from and this criticism. I mean, if you were to explain it in your terms, what is the criticism as far as you're concerned, and then what's your problem with it?
See, there are several different arguments here, and actually, as one fails, another one always pops up in its place. So it's playing whack-a-mole. So maybe I'll just give you a simple one. So one concern that actually only featured as a kind of tangent in Plantinga's original evolutionary argument against naturalism, but which nevertheless seemed to capture the Christian apologetic imagination, and so you find it wheeled out endlessly, is the thought that natural selection will select for behaviour that is adaptive.
Rather than for truth.
Rather than for true beliefs, yeah. Now, you might think that there's a very obvious response to that, which is that true belief is what produces adaptive behaviour. If you have a lot of false beliefs, if I believe that
you won't survive very long.
That there isn't a tiger in front of me, that that these poisonous berries are not in fact poisonous, I'm not going to get to survive and reproduce and pass my genetic material on. So any kind of inheritable tendency towards false belief is going to be weeded out pretty quickly by natural selection, you might think. So that's that problem dealt with. But then another layer of argument is built on, and the extra layer that's very often built on by Christian apologists is to say, yes, but beliefs only produce behaviour in combination with desires, say. I believe there's cheese in the fridge. Am I going to go to the fridge? Not yet. No, I need a desire for a cheese sandwich. Now I'm going, right? But actually, you can get true beliefs adaptive by pairing them up with certain desires. You can get them to produce adaptive behaviour, but you can also get false beliefs to produce adaptive behaviour if you just plug in the right desire next to it. The two in combination will get you the result you need in terms of surviving and reproducing. So now why should natural selection favour true beliefs rather than false beliefs? That was a kind of subsidiary argument that appeared in the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And I think it's probably the one, that kind of argument is particularly worth discussing because it's the one that people seem most familiar with, even though I suspect it's probably not the best.
I mean, is this essentially what your sort of view is built around, Angus, in terms of your questioning whether atheistic worldview can accommodate our beliefs in our ability to reason and have true beliefs and so on?
I think there are, as I said, there needs to be some care given in general to atheistic accounts and how they avoid undermining the notion of how we have rational beliefs at all. But I think there is a specific issue here. I take Stephen's, and he's mentioned it a few times it's a completely fair point. There's a danger of Christians ending up with a kind of God of the gaps argument. Here's something we can't explain. Let's posit God. I think the argument about moral capacities is very different from that because in a way, this overlaps with what we've discussed in the previous section. There are really important reasons that I think we would both share why what enables a species maximally to survive and replicate, morally speaking, will not always be the right thing. And so the question of how we have the capacity through conscience and moral sentiment to get towards the truth on that is, I think, a particularly tricky one for atheists.
We're going to have to take another break and we'll start to wrap things up in a moment's time. Today on Unbelievable, with me, Justin Brierley, we're asking, does humanism need God? And we'll be concluding that discussion with my guests today, Angus Ritchie and Stephen Law, in just a moment's time. Welcome back to the third and final part of Unbelievable this Saturday afternoon. Part of Faith Explored here on Premier Christian Radio, when we aim to help you think through your faith if you're a Christian and to think about the Christian worldview if you're not one. But part of that is that we do the profile, where we interview someone about their life and faith, their journey so far. And we're going to be hearing from two people in the profile between 4 and 5 this Saturday afternoon. John Pritchard is the former Bishop of Oxford. He joined John Pantry recently to talk about his life and faith. And we're going to be hearing the last UK interview that Andre Crouch, the legendary gospel singer who died last week, gave with Moiwa. That's between 4 and 5 this afternoon. If you want to find out more about Unbelievable, resources, past programmes, how to get hold of the podcast, and to even add your comments as well under recent shows, then go to the website of Unbelievable, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. I'd be delighted to hear from you as well if you want to get in touch, and we'll be hearing some of your feedback to last week's programme. You can find us via the social media sites at UnbelievableJB, to follow me on Twitter, facebook.com/UnbelievableJB to find us on Facebook as well and leave a comment that way. Also worth mentioning that Faith Explored is brought to you in association with Premier Christianity magazine, and if you haven't got yourself a copy, you can easily do that. We give them away free for those who aren't yet subscribers. So if you want to find out about their most recent edition, why not go online now to premierchristianity.com. We've got a great section in the magazine called Faith Explored that ties into this Saturday afternoon section of our programming on Premier. And this month, or in the most recent edition, the February edition, which has just landed, you can read my interview with Shabir Ali, one of Islam's most prominent apologists, and the corresponding response article by Nabil Qureshi on why he left Islam to follow Jesus. That's all available from the website too, though, if you want to read those articles for yourself. premierchristianity.com. Okay, let's get into the final part of today's discussion on Christianity, humanism and atheism.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
We've been asking today whether human dignity, morality and reason can be justified on an atheistic worldview, something we've done in different ways over the years, but in this case particularly in respect of the things that many humanists, and by that very often it's come to be known as atheistic humanism, hold dear. And the author of a recent report, Angus Ritchie, on this has been with me in studio. If you want to find that report from Theos, it's at theosthinktank.co.uk. The Case for Christian Humanism, Why Christians Should Believe in Humanism and Humanists in Christianity. Stephen Law has also joined me, philosopher who heads up the Centre for Inquiry in the UK. He's criticised the report. You can read it on his blog at centreforinquiry.net. And in that last section, gentlemen, as we've gone around this in a few ways, we finished up at the third leg, if you like, of your argument of why humanism needs Christianity, and that is to validate its belief in reason as trustworthy and everything else. And we haven't had time really to dig that out. It is a complex and quite philosophical subject, but you gave a neat summary to some extent at the end of that last section, Angus, of that. You wanted to respond quickly before we start to wrap things up, I think, Stephen.
Yes, there is a little bit of a whiff of God of the Gaps, I think, about this Theos report. I mean, Angus is a smart guy, and he's written a very good book, actually, From Morality to Metaphysics, on the problem of explaining how knowledge of objective moral truths can be solved. Why are our faculties going to track those truths? If you're a theist, you've got it covered. There's a God. He wants us to have that knowledge. He has the magical power to provide it. And Bob's your uncle. There's your explanation straight away. It's just like explaining why it is that your keys have ended up mysteriously on the mantelpiece. You can't explain it. It's baffling. But I got it covered with my gremlin explanation.
Well,
okay?
Yes and no. I mean, I suppose the thing is that, as I understand it, Stephen, unlike some atheists, you do believe in an objective realm of moral values and duties,
so let me just say,
which is kind of hard to explain at some level.
Of course, it's
on
hard
an
to explain.
atheistic
There are all sorts of things that are hard to explain if you don't invoke a magical being with magical powers. That's always going to be the case, I'm afraid. And so I'm just going to tackle those problems head on. And I don't have a particular theory or answer to this question. I'm just pointing out that the mere fact that I can't come up with a good answer at this particular moment in time, and in fact it may be really quite a thorny problem given the non-theistic position, because we don't have that nice, convenient, quick answer every time. It may be it's a tough one. I know. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I can't see that particularly gives me a reason to sign up to theism any more than your own ability to explain how your keys ended up.
It's given some people a reason to. I mean, there was that famous case not so long ago that Leia Libresco was an atheist blogger. It was this specific argument that made her embrace Christianity.
Yes, the moral argument, one of the weakest, but one of the most rhetorically powerful arguments, which is where you always find it in the arsenal of arguments being used by Christian apologists. It works. There's no doubt about that. That's not to say it's a good argument. Look, I think that it's a big, interesting problem. I don't have a nice, easy solution to it. I'll happily admit that. But that doesn't mean that I'm now under some obligation to sign up to Angus's particular answer. And in fact, I think there are good reasons for not signing up to that particular answer. It seems to me that there's abundant evidence that Angus's God doesn't exist. And if there is such evidence, then it's really not, in much the same way as there's abundant evidence that gremlins don't exist. So if that's true, then obviously it's not sensible for me to adopt the gremlins explanation.
It's just an area of mystery that you're happy to live with.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I'm not happy to live with it. I want it solved, God damn it. But I can't solve it. But I'm not going to reach for the easy snake oil, off-the-shelf answer, or a magical being with magical powers did it.
That's a very kind of pejorative way of terming the Christian worldview.
Correct,
but I mean, is it God of the gaps? Is it magical being with magical powers? Here's my answer to all the little mysteries we come up with in life, including the issue of human dignity, worth, morality, and reason. I mean, that's what Stephen's saying is it's too easy an answer. It explains too much, at that level. What's your answer to that, Agnes?
Yeah, I think clearly not. I think I would frame the issue slightly differently, that the world has for a long time looked like it had some kind of purpose. That's been a kind of thing that's occurred to people across the universe. It's not just about explaining. I think there's a categorical difference between immediate explanation of random event by God did it versus actually a bit more of a systematic account of why we might have reason to believe in a God with certain characteristics and why that might provide a good explanation for certain kinds of things. And I think Christians should acknowledge that there are areas where it was plausible to make quite a direct argument of that kind before Darwin, where it's not anymore.
Okay.
And that seems to me, absolutely the case. So that's why in the case of From Morality to Metaphysics, about which Stephen is so kind, cheap at the price, 30 quid, I think, that's why I'm very careful to say, I think we have reason to think there's not just a problem we haven't quite solved yet. There's a push either to a very ethically problematic non-realism or a problem that it just looks like natural selection can't answer, because the only two things it seems to have is something to do with what will help survival and replication and random mutation. So it's a kind of in principle argument. I think it's I hope carefully made, because it doesn't want to do the oh my goodness, I can't find my keys. The Lord must have hidden them. So I think there is something here. And I think, in a funny way, I think we're in more agreement than I expected, in that Stephen agrees that there is an interesting thing here. And I agree, and say in the book, that this on its own wouldn't be, if you think theism's got a huge number of other intellectual problems, this ain't going to solve it. But it is just about having a little bit more of a sense that these issues aren't straightforward for either side.
Sure. And
this one is one where theism, which I think are independent reasons for believing.
You want to warn humanist atheists that if you're just assuming that humans have this inherent dignity, worth, and so on, where does that assumption come from? You're just saying, I'd just like you to question that assumption and what foundation is. Because I think a lot of humanists, perhaps who haven't had the time to think philosophically through these issues, there is a kind of an assumption there.
Yes,
and I think you equally would ask them to question that
I will always
statement.
encourage people to question their assumptions. I'm a philosopher. I think it's a valuable exercise. So I would, if they've just taken that for granted in an unthinking way because Richard Dawkins told them to, say, that's not a very good reason. That's not a very good. However, in my experience, actually, humanists tend to be fairly well-educated, thoughtful people, and that's often why they're humanists. And so I don't think that, as a general rule, it would be fair to say, oh, look, you Mr. or Mrs. Humanist, you're just assuming these things. I think they really just assume them. I think they usually interrogate them and think about them and read books, some of which provide good answers, some of which provide perhaps not such good answers. Where am I going with this? I think here's the thought I was going to end up with, which is this, really, that if there's a really good case for not believing in God, and I think there is, actually, then if Angus can show, and this is an enormous if, obviously, if he could show that you can't have knowledge of objective moral value, in the absence of such a being, then I'll just go, oh, well, then we can't have knowledge of objective moral value then. Perhaps there is no objective moral value.
You drop that realm rather than say, yes, therefore God, as it were.
Yeah, but not out of preference. You're making it sound like, oh, anything but God. No. I'm going where the reason takes me. So if Angus can show that I can't have this knowledge unless there's a God, but oh dear, there's overwhelming evidence that there ain't no such God, then I'll have to accept that my very powerful intuition that I do have such knowledge is mistaken. But, intuitions have turned out to be mistaken before. And you might say, oh, and that's terrible, ethically speaking. It really matters if nothing ethically matters. But of course, if nothing ethically matters, it doesn't matter that nothing ethically matters.
Yes, I suppose that's true. Well, no, it's been really interesting. Angus,
I just wanted to... I'm
word
really struck by the fact that this kind of seems to make the point of the report that, what we started with was some fundamentals about ethics mattering, about the dignity of the individual, and there do seem to be some serious arguments here that make that wobble for atheist humanism. That's all we're trying to say, and that appears to some extent to be common ground.
You're putting a little stone in the shoe, a little wobble in. But anyway, it's interesting stuff. Thank you very much. And if you want to, of course, read the report in full, theosthinktank.co.uk is where you can find links to it. They've made it all completely available for free. So go and you can even comment on it and all sorts. And, of course, make sure to read Stephen's response at his blog as well. I'll make sure there are direct links from today's programme online to both of those, so you can go straight there if you go to premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable and avail yourself of the resources underneath today's programme.